The email came in at 8:07 a.m., 3 minutes after I sat down and took my coat off. No greeting, no warning, just a subject line that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Performance improvement plan, immediate discussion required. I stared at it for a full 30 seconds, convinced it had to be a mistake. I'd been with this company for 12 years. 12 years of late nights, skipped lunches, canceled vacations, weekends sacrificed without being asked twice. 12 years of watching people come and go while I stayed. I trained half the managers, who now walked past my desk without making eye contact. I built processes they still bragged about in meetings like they were born that way. And now this. I clicked the email. It was formal, cold, HR language, carefully worded like it had been reviewed by lawyers who had never met me. It said my recent performance had raised concerns, that there were gaps in alignment, that leadership wanted to support my improvement. Support. That word sat there like an insult. They scheduled the meeting for 10 a.m. same day. No prep, no context, just a calendar invite with my name on it, my manager's name on it, and HR copied in like an observer at an execution. I looked around the office. People were laughing near the coffee machine. Someone was complaining about the printer. Everything felt normal. Too normal. Like the world hadn't gotten the memo that something was very wrong. I forwarded the email to my personal account. Not because I planned to do anything dramatic. Just instinct. Something in me knew I needed a record. At 9:58, I walked into the small glass conference room. My manager, Daniel, was already there. HR sat beside him with a laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard like she was about to take notes on my character. Daniel didn't look uncomfortable. That should have been my first clue. He smiled the way people do when they're about to say something awful, but want credit for being kind. "Thanks for coming in," he said. "This won't take long." That's another lie people tell right before your life gets complicated. HR slid a document across the table. I recognized the format immediately. Bullet points, metrics, timelines, signatures at the bottom. A performance improvement plan. After 12 years. I didn't interrupt. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I let him talk. I let him explain how my communication style had become challenging, how I was resistant to change, how leadership felt I wasn't aligned with the new direction. New direction. That phrase again. The truth was simpler, but nobody said it out loud. The company had changed. Leadership had changed. The people who remembered what I'd built were gone, and I had become inconvenient. I asked one question. "Can you give me a specific example of where my performance failed?" Daniel glanced at HR. HR glanced at her screen. He said, "It's more about overall perception." Perception. Not numbers. Not results. Not missed deadlines. Perception. I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded. HR explained the plan. 60 days. Weekly check-ins. Clear expectations. Failure to meet them could result in further action. Termination. That's what they meant. They slid the document back toward me with a pen. "Please review and sign," HR said. "This doesn't mean you agree. Just that we discussed it." That's another lie. Signing always means something later. I didn't sign right away. I asked if I could take a copy home. Daniel hesitated. Just a second. But I saw it. "Of course," he said. "We trust you." Trust. I left the room feeling like the floor had shifted an inch to the left. Not enough to knock me down. Enough to make every step feel wrong. At my desk, I opened my laptop and pulled up my calendar. Back-to-back meetings. Budget reviews. Forecast approvals. Vendor calls. All the things I'd been doing quietly for years. All the things nobody else seemed to fully understand. All the things that made the company run without drama. I took a breath and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened the budget control system. I wasn't finance. Technically, My role sat between operations and strategy. But over the years, responsibility had piled up the way it always does when you're reliable. I controlled approvals. I managed allocations. I had authority over cost centers most people didn't even know existed. Not because I asked for power, because nobody else wanted the responsibility. I stared at the numbers. 7 figures, spread across departments, projects midstream, contracts dependent on sign-off. And suddenly the PIP made sense. Finance didn't know. They didn't know that every major spend went through me. That delays, approvals, adjustments all landed on my desk. That the flexibility leadership loved bragging about came from me, quietly making things work. They saw me as support. Replaceable. I closed the system without changing anything. Not yet. That day, the office felt different. Daniel avoided my desk. HR avoided my eyes. A junior manager I'd trained walked past me like I might be contagious. At lunch, I didn't eat. I read the PIP again. It criticized my tone in meetings, my lack of enthusiasm, my hesitation to adopt new processes. New processes like approving spend without documentation, like pushing budgets through without oversight, like smiling and nodding while decisions were made by people who didn't understand consequences. I thought about the last 12 years, about the time I stayed late fixing an error that would have cost the company millions, the time I took blame for a delay that wasn't mine, the time I warned leadership about a vendor risk they ignored until it blew up. None of that was in the document. At 3:42 p.m., Finance sent an email asking me to approve a reallocation. I stared at it. I approved it, not because I was afraid, because I wanted them comfortable. That night, at home, I printed the PIP and spread it out on my kitchen table. I highlighted every vague phrase, every subjective criticism, every place where perception replaced proof. I slept badly, dreamed of being called into rooms where nobody would meet my eyes. The next morning, Daniel scheduled my first check-in. He asked how I was feeling. I said focused. He smiled like that was the correct answer. Over the next 2 weeks, nothing changed on the surface. I did my job. I hit every deadline. I responded politely. I documented everything. But behind the scenes, something shifted. Finance started missing numbers. Small things at first. A report delayed. A forecast slightly off. They asked questions. I answered them. Slowly, carefully, with documentation. Daniel started CCing leadership on emails. Subtle pressure. Paper trail. HR asked if I had any concerns about the plan. I said no. I'm following it. Which was true. What I didn't say was that I was also watching how quickly people forgot what I did, watching how decisions piled up without context, watching how confident leadership was in a system they didn't understand. One afternoon, a vendor called me directly. They said payment hadn't gone through. I checked. The approval was pending. Mine. I could have pushed it through in 30 seconds. Instead, I asked Finance to clarify the allocation code. They took 2 days to respond. The vendor escalated. Finance escalated. Daniel asked me why things felt slow lately. I said, I'm being thorough, per the PIP. He didn't like that answer. By week 3, tension sat in the office like humidity before a storm. People whispered. Meetings ran long. Finance started scrambling. Still, nobody asked me directly what I controlled. Nobody connected the dots. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I wasn't doing anything unethical. I was simply doing exactly what they'd asked. Carefully, by the book, with oversight, the way I always should have been allowed to. One evening, as I shut down my computer, I caught my reflection in the dark screen. I looked tired, older, but there was something else there too. Clarity. They thought the PIP was leverage. They had no idea it was a spotlight. And Finance still didn't know who controlled the budget. By the start of week 4, people stopped saying good morning to me. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing obvious. Just small hesitations. Half smiles. Conversations that went quiet when I walked past. I had been in offices long enough to recognize the shift. It wasn't hostility. It was discomfort. The kind that comes when people sense something is wrong, but don't know where the fault line is yet. The PIP had done its job. It didn't just isolate me from leadership. It signaled to everyone else that I was marked. Temporary. Someone whose name could be spoken freely once I was gone. Daniel leaned into it. He started asking for daily updates. Not because he needed them. Because he wanted a record. He asked questions he already knew the answers to. He forwarded my replies to HR with phrases like, for visibility and just documenting. I answered every email calmly, professionally, with receipts. What he didn't see was how much those emails exposed the cracks elsewhere. Finance was unraveling quietly. The more I followed process, the slower things moved. The more questions I asked, the more confusion surfaced. Approvals that used to glide through suddenly stalled because no one could clearly explain why money was moving the way it was. I wasn't blocking anything. I was asking them to explain their own decisions. That was enough. One morning, I got a call from Monica in finance. She'd been there almost as long as I had. We'd survived 3 restructures together. She didn't sound angry. She sounded worried. Hey, she said, do you have a minute? I did. She asked about a quarterly adjustment that leadership had approved verbally months ago but never documented. Finance needed it finalized for reporting. I asked her to send me the approval chain. There wasn't one, just a meeting note. No sign-off, no allocation code, no documentation tying the adjustment to an actual decision. I told her I couldn't approve it without backup. There was a long pause. You've always approved these before, she said. Yes, I said. Before the PIP. I didn't say it bitterly. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated a fact. Monica exhaled slowly. Okay, I'll see what I can find. She didn't find anything. 2 days later, leadership started asking why finance reports were delayed. Finance said approvals were pending. Daniel asked me about it in our weekly check-in. You seem to be creating bottlenecks, he said, leaning back in his chair like this was casual feedback. I'm following documented process, I replied. And the improvement plan? HR nodded. She typed something. Daniel's jaw tightened. He shifted tactics after that. He started assigning me redundant tasks. Busy work. Things that took time but added no value. It was subtle punishment. Death by 1,000 little requests. I did them all. At the same time, I started documenting my workload. Not because they asked. Because I knew they'd eventually pretend it didn't exist. By midweek, finance escalated to leadership. I wasn't copied, but I heard about it anyway. Offices are porous. Stress travels. Leadership wanted to know why money wasn't moving. Finance wanted to know who had final authority. That question landed differently this time, because the answer wasn't obvious. My role had evolved quietly over the years. Responsibilities piled on without title changes. Authority given verbally, then forgotten. Documentation scattered across emails and systems only I fully understood. Leadership assumed finance controlled finance. Finance assumed leadership had oversight. And I sat in the middle. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk unannounced. He stood there too long, arms crossed, watching my screen like he was searching for something wrong. How are you feeling about the plan? He asked. I looked up at him. I'm clear on expectations. He nodded. Good. Because there's concern you're being inflexible. In what way? I asked. He gestured vaguely. You're pushing back a lot. I'm asking for documentation, I said. He smiled thinly. We don't want process to become an excuse. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Because process was the only thing protecting all of us from chaos. and they were asking me to abandon it while criticizing me for not aligning. That night, I went back through old emails. Years of them. Approvals, delegations, messages from executives saying things like, run it through her, and she'll take care of it. Proof, without realizing it, had been proof. I saved everything. The next week, the pressure escalated. HR scheduled an additional support meeting. Leadership was added. Finance wasn't. They wanted to talk about impact. They said teams felt slowed down, that morale was being affected, that my insistence on detail was creating friction. I asked one question. Is there a documented change to approval authority? Silence. Someone cleared their throat. Daniel said, we're discussing behavior, not structure. I can't change behavior without clarity on structure, I replied. HR typed faster. Leadership exchanged looks. That meeting ended with nothing resolved. Just tension, thick enough to taste. After that, finance stopped calling me directly. They started routing things through Daniel. Daniel routed them back to me. The loop became obvious. Things stalled further. By the end of the month, the numbers didn't reconcile. Finance flagged it as a risk. Leadership panicked. They scheduled an emergency review. This time, finance was invited. I walked into that meeting knowing something was about to snap. The CFO opened with frustration. Deadlines missed. Vendors complaining. Reports delayed. He asked finance what the issue was. Finance said approvals were unclear. He asked Daniel. Daniel said I was resistant. Then the CFO turned to me. He asked, why aren't things moving? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply said, because I'm following the authority structure as documented, and there are gaps. What gaps? He asked. I slid a printed chart across the table, a clean, simple map of budget flows. Who requested, who reviewed, who approved, and at the center of it, my role. Highlighted. Silence spread across the room. The CFO frowned. Is this accurate? Finance leaned forward. Monica squinted at the page. Yes, she said slowly. That's how it's been working. Daniel's face drained of color. Leadership started asking questions. Not about me. About process. About why so much authority sat with someone they'd just put on a performance plan. HR looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. The meeting ended abruptly. Nobody thanked me. Nobody apologized. But something fundamental had shifted. After that, Daniel stopped hovering. HR stopped scheduling extra meetings. Finance started asking questions more carefully. Leadership asked for documentation. Lots of it. They didn't remove the PP, but they stopped pushing. I could feel the balance changing. People started saying good morning again. Quietly, carefully, like they weren't sure which direction safety pointed yet. One afternoon, I overheard someone say, we didn't realize how much she handled. Another replied, yeah, finance is kind of lost without her. I didn't react. I just kept working, because I knew this wasn't over. The plan still existed. The threat still hovered. And now leadership had a new problem. They tried to sideline someone who held the system together. And finance was finally starting to understand that the budget didn't move without me. Leadership didn't admit they'd made a mistake. They never do. Instead, they tried to reclaim control, quietly, the way people do when they realize too late that they underestimated someone but don't want to lose face. It started with meetings I wasn't invited to. Calendar blocks labeled alignment and process review that suddenly appeared on everyone else's schedules. I only knew because people talked. Finance whispered. Operations speculated. HR went silent. Daniel became distant in a different way. Not hostile. Calculated. He stopped giving feedback altogether. No check-ins. No follow-ups. Just radio silence, which told me more than any criticism ever had. They were trying to figure out how to move money without me. The problem was, The system didn't care about their intentions. Approvals still routed to my queue. Flags still triggered when documentation was missing. Controls still required my sign-off to clear exceptions. They could talk around me all they wanted. The machinery still stopped at my desk. One morning, I logged in and noticed something new. Someone had attempted to change approval permissions. Not successfully, but the attempt was there. A partial request, half-filled, abandoned. Whoever did it hadn't known which levers to pull. That told me two things. First, they were trying to bypass me. Second, they didn't understand the system nearly as well as they thought. I said nothing. At 11:13 a.m., Finance sent out a company-wide notice about temporary delays in processing. They framed it like a system issue, a technical hiccup. It wasn't technical. It was human. That afternoon, Daniel finally scheduled another meeting. HR included. Leadership absent. His tone was different this time. Less confident. More rehearsed. "We want to empower teams," he said. "Reduce dependency on single points." Single point. That was me. "I agree," I replied. "Redundancy is important." He nodded, relieved I hadn't pushed back. "So we're thinking of redistributing some responsibilities," he continued, "to streamline operations." "Happy to help document transitions," I said. That was not the response he expected. HR looked up sharply. Daniel hesitated. "Well, yes, that would be helpful." "Great," I said. "I'll need clarity on who's assuming final approval authority and under what controls." Silence again. HR typed. Daniel cleared his throat. "We're still working through that." "Until then," I said calmly, "existing controls should remain in place." Daniel's jaw tightened. After that meeting, I started getting strange emails. Requests phrased vaguely. People asking me to just move things along or help unblock. I replied with questions, always polite, always documented. Each question exposed how little clarity actually existed. Finance started panicking openly. The CFO scheduled daily huddles. People scrambled to produce explanations for numbers that no longer lined up neatly. One vendor threatened to pause service. Leadership demanded urgency. Urgency doesn't fix structural ignorance. It just makes it louder. By week 6, the PIP deadline loomed. HR emailed asking for a self-assessment. I wrote it carefully. Fact-based. Calm. Detailed. I listed every task I'd completed. Every metric hit. Every delay traced to missing approvals or undocumented decisions. I attached evidence. A lot of it. Daniel submitted his assessment separately. I never saw it, but I didn't need to. I could tell from his behavior that it wasn't glowing. The review meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. All the usual players. HR, Daniel, a senior leader I rarely interacted with. Finance wasn't invited. That felt intentional. The meeting started stiff. HR reviewed the goals. Daniel commented on my tone. Leadership talked about fit. Then I was asked to respond. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I didn't bring up loyalty, or tenure, or sacrifice. I talked about outcomes. I talked about controls, about risk, about what happened when processes were bypassed. I explained clearly and calmly how my role intersected with financial stability. Leadership listened differently this time, not warmly, but attentively. Then I asked a question. "Before we talk about next steps, can we clarify who currently holds budget authority if my role is reduced?" That question landed hard. The senior leader frowned. Finance wasn't there to answer. HR glanced at Daniel. Daniel looked away. I continued, "Because finance has escalated several times due to unclear authority, and attempts have been made to adjust permissions without success." HR's fingers froze on the keyboard. The senior leader sat back. "Who attempted adjustments?" he asked. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply said, "The system logs show attempts. I don't have visibility into intent." That was enough. The meeting ended without a decision. HR said they needed more time. Daniel didn't meet my eyes as we left. That evening, my inbox exploded. Finance asking for help. Leadership asking for reports. HR asking for clarification. I answered everything. Slowly, carefully, by the book. The following Monday, something changed. I was copied on an email chain between finance and leadership discussing interim authority. My name was mentioned, not as a problem, as a dependency. That's when the tone shifted again. Daniel started being friendly. Too friendly. Compliments where criticism used to be. Thank yous that felt rehearsed. HR stopped mentioning the PIP. Leadership asked for my input directly. It was transparent. They needed me functional until they figured out how to replace the function. I knew the pattern. I'd seen it before. People like me are useful until they aren't. Then quietly erased. So I started preparing. Not to leave. To protect myself. I documented everything. Every approval. Every request. Every delay caused by missing authority. I saved logs. Reports. Emails. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning survival. By the end of week 7, finance was barely holding together. Reports were late. Audits loomed. Vendors restless. Leadership called another emergency meeting. This time, finance led it. They laid out the risks. Clearly. Professionally. Without drama. They said the system depended on centralized oversight that hadn't been formally acknowledged. They said redistributing authority without redesign would cause failures. They said trying to rush around controls would increase exposure. Leadership listened. Then someone asked the question no one wanted to ask. What happens if she's removed? Silence. Finance didn't answer right away. Monica finally spoke. Honestly, she said, we'd be blind for months. That sentence changed everything. After that meeting, Daniel stopped pretending. He avoided me completely. HR went quiet again. Leadership went into damage control mode. The PIP still existed on paper, but it was no longer the weapon they thought it was. It had become evidence. Evidence that they'd targeted someone without understanding the system she ran. And now they were trapped between pride and practicality, because they couldn't fire me without breaking something. And they couldn't admit that putting me on a performance plan had been a mistake. That tension hung over everything. Every email, every meeting, every delayed approval. And beneath it all, a question they still hadn't answered. How do you get rid of someone who knows where all the bodies are buried when you don't even know what they do yet? HR didn't call it an investigation. They never do. They called it a reset. That was the word they used when they finally reached out after 2 weeks of silence. A polite email, neutral tone, calendar invite titled Path Forward Discussion. No agenda, no attachments, just me, HR, and a senior HR partner I'd never met before. That alone told me this was no longer routine. The meeting started with concern, not apology. Concern. They talked about stress, about misalignment, about how things had escalated in unintended ways. They said the goal was to stabilize operations while addressing interpersonal friction. Interpersonal, as if systems collapsed because of feelings. I listened. I nodded. I waited. Then the senior HR partner said it. We're considering closing the performance improvement plan early. There it was. Not admitting it was wrong. Just quietly erasing it. With conditions, she added quickly. We'd like to redefine your role. Narrow the scope. Narrow the scope. That meant take the power, keep the work. I asked one question. What happens to the responsibilities currently tied to that scope? HR smiled. The professional one. We'll reassign them. To whom? I asked. Silence again. She said, that's still under discussion. I leaned forward slightly. Because finance has expressed concern about reassignments without redesign. The HR partner stiffened. Finance has been vocal. Vocal, another word for correct. They proposed a temporary solution. I'd retain responsibilities during transition. I'd help train others, document processes, create guides. I saw it clearly now. They wanted my brain without my authority. They wanted continuity without control. I didn't refuse. I said, I'm open to clarity, but any transition needs formal authority mapping. HR nodded like that was reasonable, then asked me to sign a document acknowledging the closure of the PP. I read it carefully. The language was slippery. It said the plan was concluded without prejudice. That performance concerns remained on record. A stain without the weapon. I didn't sign. I'll review and revert, I said. HR didn't push. That afternoon, finance escalated again, this time loudly. They sent leadership a risk memo. Formal, attached to audit implications. Copied legal. I was included. They laid out the dependencies, named the roles, listed the controls. They didn't name me as the problem. They named me as the function. Leadership couldn't ignore it anymore. A senior executive emailed asking for an emergency alignment meeting. Everyone was invited. HR, finance, operations, legal, and me. The tone of that meeting was different from the start. Less posturing, more urgency. Legal asked questions about documentation. Finance answered with evidence. Operations admitted they didn't fully understand the flows. HR tried to steer it toward people issues. Legal shut that down. This is a governance issue, they said. That word landed like a gavel. Governance doesn't care about tone. Governance cares about accountability. Then legal asked the question that mattered. Who formally owns budget approval authority today? Nobody answered. Not immediately. I didn't jump in. Finance finally said, functionally she does. Legal turned to me. Is that accurate? Yes, I said, based on documented delegations and system controls. Legal nodded slowly, then altering that without redesign creates risk. Leadership shifted in their seats. HR looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. The meeting ended with action items. Formal ones, deadlines, owners. For the first time since the PIP, everything was written down. After that, HR stopped pushing the reset. They stopped asking me to train anyone. They stopped talking about narrowing scope. Instead, they went quiet. Too quiet. Daniel disappeared completely. I didn't hear from him for days. Finance started copying me on everything. Not out of loyalty. Out of necessity. People in the office started treating me differently again. Careful respect. Questions before decisions. The kind of behavior you see when people realize someone almost got cut out and shouldn't have. One afternoon, Monica came by my desk. She lowered her voice. They're trying to move approvals to a committee, she said. I wasn't surprised. They don't want it tied to one person, she added. Committees still need authority, I said. She smiled grimly. That's what we told them. By week 8, leadership announced a temporary governance committee. They framed it as best practice. In reality, it was panic management. The committee needed documentation, systems access, controls, all things I handled. They asked me to support it. I agreed. I didn't volunteer more than necessary. I watched as the committee struggled with decisions that used to take minutes. Disagreements surfaced. Delays multiplied. The illusion that I was the problem evaporated quickly. HR tried one last move. They scheduled a one-on-one. This time the tone was softer. They talked about trust, about moving forward, about mutual accountability. Then they asked if I'd be willing to accept a role change to reduce friction. A demotion without the word. I asked, does that come with reduced responsibility? They said, we'd still need your expertise. There it was again. Expertise without authority. I said no, not angrily, not dramatically. I said that would increase risk. HR didn't argue. They just nodded. That was the moment I knew the balance had tipped. Because HR had stopped trying to control me. They were trying to contain the situation. And finance was no longer backing down. The committee missed its first reporting deadline. Leadership scrambled. Legal sent follow-ups. Auditors asked questions. And suddenly the narrative shifted completely. It wasn't about my performance anymore. It was about why the company had allowed so much responsibility to sit unacknowledged for so long, and who had decided to destabilize it with a performance plan instead of addressing structure. That question hung heavy in every meeting. Unspoken, uncomfortable, and now someone was going to have to answer it. Daniel came back into focus the moment accountability started moving upward. That wasn't a coincidence. For weeks, he'd been invisible. No check-ins, no feedback, no presence unless absolutely necessary. That's what people do when they're hoping a problem resolves itself without their fingerprints on it. But once leadership started asking who initiated the performance improvement plan, his name resurfaced quietly. First in side conversations, then in emails, then in meetings where his absence became noticeable. It turned out the PP hadn't come from HR. HR had approved it, but the push came from Daniel. He'd framed it as proactive, as leadership development, as addressing soft concerns before they became hard problems. He hadn't mentioned the budget. He hadn't mentioned authority. He hadn't mentioned dependency. He'd described me as resistant, as difficult, as someone struggling to adapt. Leadership believed him, because leadership didn't know what I actually did. The governance committee's second meeting went worse than the first. Disagreements stalled approvals. Finance and operations clashed. Legal flagged risks. Nobody wanted final sign-off. Someone asked, "How did she do this alone for years?" No one answered. By then, the auditors had formally requested documentation trails. Finance pulled historical records. My name appeared everywhere. Email approvals, system logs, exception notes. The realization came slowly, then all at once. They hadn't just put a senior employee on a performance plan. They'd destabilized a control pillar. Leadership scheduled a closed-door meeting. I wasn't invited, but the outcome reached me anyway. Daniel was asked to explain his decision-making, specifically why he'd escalated performance concerns instead of flagging structural risk. He said it was about behavior. They asked for examples. He talked about tone, pushback, meetings. They asked if any of that impacted financial integrity. He said no. That was the wrong answer, because finance was sitting right there with evidence showing otherwise. After that meeting, Daniel's emails changed. Shorter, more formal, careful. He stopped CCing HR on everything. HR stopped CCing him. He scheduled a one-on-one with me for the first time in weeks. The invite came late afternoon. No subject, just a time. I accepted. When he walked into the room, he didn't sit right away. He stood there, hands on the back of the chair, like he was grounding himself. "This got bigger than I expected," he said. That was his opening line. Not an apology, not accountability, just surprise. I didn't respond. He continued. "I was trying to manage risk." By sidelining the person holding it together? I asked. He winced. "That's not how I saw it." "That's how it worked," I said. He sat down slowly. "They're asking questions," he said, "about approvals, about authority, about why I didn't escalate concerns differently." I nodded. "They want documentation," he added. I said nothing. Then he said something that surprised me. "I didn't know you controlled that much." There it was. The truth. Not malice. Ignorance. I met his eyes. "You never asked." He looked down. The meeting ended without resolution. No apology. No reconciliation. Just the quiet understanding that he was no longer steering this. HR followed up the next day. They asked for a written summary of my role. Not an opinion. A description. I gave them a factual document. No emotion. No editorializing. It was long. Legal requested a copy. Leadership requested a briefing. Finance requested confirmation. The governance committee stalled again. Leadership postponed decisions, because now every move required confronting how exposed they'd been. Daniel stopped being invited to certain meetings. He noticed. He grew tense. He started asking me questions again. Careful ones. Can you clarify how this works? What happens if this isn't approved? Who usually signs off? I answered, professionally, without warmth, because this wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure the record was clear. The audit findings came in quietly. No penalties, but recommendations. Formal ones. They flagged concentration of authority risk. They flagged lack of succession planning. They flagged management action that increased exposure. That last one stung. Leadership couldn't ignore it. They scheduled a restructuring discussion. This time I was invited. So was finance. Daniel was present, but quieter. They talked about formalizing authority, about titles, about reporting lines. They talked about lessons learned. Nobody said my name in relation to the PP, but everyone knew. The conversation circled the real issue without naming it. Finally, the CFO spoke. We can't afford to undermine critical roles without understanding impact. He looked at me when he said it, not accusing, acknowledging. Daniel stared at the table. After that meeting, HR reached out again. This time, they asked how the PP had affected me, not as a checkbox, as a question. I answered honestly. I said it damaged trust. I said it created unnecessary risk. I said it exposed flaws that should have been addressed structurally, not personally. They listened. They took notes. Daniel wasn't copied. The next week, leadership announced changes. Formal documentation of authority. Clear approval paths. Backup roles identified. No mention of the PIP. But Daniel's role shifted. Subtly. Responsibilities redistributed. Oversight added. He wasn't fired, but he wasn't untouchable anymore. The office felt different. Not calmer. More cautious. People double-checked before acting. Finance slowed things deliberately now. Leadership asked questions they should have asked years ago. And me? I wasn't celebrated. I wasn't promoted. I wasn't thanked publicly. But I wasn't ignored anymore. And that mattered, because the story had flipped. I wasn't the problem to be managed. I was the risk they almost mishandled. And everyone in that building knew it. Once the immediate risk passed, leadership did what they always do. They tried to rewrite the story, not in documents, not officially, but in tone, in phrasing, in the way people talked about what happened. The performance improvement plan slowly disappeared from conversation, replaced by phrases like growing pains and learning moments. No one said mistake. No one said wrong. They talked about evolution, about maturity, about strengthening systems. And quietly, they tried to make it seem like this had always been the plan. I noticed it in meetings first. Someone would say, as we discussed earlier this year. Another would add, this transition was already underway. It wasn't, but memory is malleable when no one challenges it. They started crediting the governance committee for stability. They praised cross-functional alignment. They talked about resilience. What they didn't mention was the near collapse, the confusion, the panic, the way everything jammed when one approval stopped moving. And they definitely didn't mention why it jammed. HR reached out again, framing it as closure. They wanted to finalize documentation, clean things up, put a bow on it. They asked me to review a summary of events. It was polished, neutral, carefully vague. It said the PIP was initiated as part of ongoing performance management. It said process gaps were identified during parallel review. It said adjustments were made collaboratively. I stared at the document for a long time, because this was the moment. If I let this stand, The record would show that the PP had been reasonable, that the fallout was incidental, that leadership had acted responsibly, and the next time someone like me became inconvenient, the same thing would happen. Quietly, I sent the document back with comments. Factual ones, dates, timelines, cause and effect. I didn't accuse. I clarified. I wrote things like, the PIP preceded the identification of process gaps. Authority mapping occurred after operational delays. Governance changes were reactive, not planned. HR responded quickly. They asked if I was comfortable softening the language. I said no. I said accuracy mattered. They paused. Leadership didn't love that. I could feel it in the way emails slowed, in the way meetings were scheduled without me again. Not excluded, just delayed. The rewrite attempt continued anyway. Town halls referenced lessons learned. Managers repeated talking points. Daniel started speaking up again, carefully, aligning himself with the new narrative. I watched him do it in a meeting. He said, we all recognized early on that our processes needed strengthening. Early on, I looked around the table. Finance looked down. Legal said nothing. I didn't interrupt. But afterward, I sent a follow-up email summarizing the meeting. I included dates. I included context. I kept it professional. That email got a lot of quiet replies. People thanking me. People saying, I'm glad you wrote that down. That's when I realized something important. Leadership could rewrite the story out loud, but they couldn't erase the written record. And the written record had my fingerprints all over it. A week later, HR tried another angle. They asked how I felt about rebuilding trust with Daniel. They suggested mediation. I said I was open to professional collaboration. I did not say trust. Trust is earned. Mediation happened anyway. Daniel apologized. Sort of. He said he regretted how things unfolded. Not what he did. Not the decision. Just the outcome. I acknowledged the apology. I did not validate the narrative. After mediation, he stopped trying to rewrite things around me. He rewrote them elsewhere. Leadership announced a formal closure of the situation. They thanked everyone for adaptability. They praised resilience. They moved on, but not everyone forgot. Finance didn't, legal didn't, and I didn't, because I could see the next phase coming. Once a system stabilizes, people look for comfort. And comfort in organizations often means pushing uncomfortable truths back into the shadows. They started talking about efficiency again, about speed, about reducing friction. Those words rang differently now, because I knew what they really meant. They meant fewer questions, less documentation, more trust. Trust in people who hadn't earned it. I pushed back gently, not publicly, in documentation, in controls, in questions that forced people to slow down. Some appreciated it, some resented it. Daniel avoided eye contact again. HR watched closely. Leadership weighed options. I wasn't in immediate danger anymore, but I wasn't safe either, because I'd become something worse than a problem. I'd become a reminder. And organizations don't like reminders of their own failures. They like clean endings, simple stories, heroes and villains neatly assigned. This story had neither. It had systems. It had ego. It had quiet decisions with loud consequences. And it wasn't over, because the next move wouldn't be loud. It would be subtle, and it would force me to decide something I'd been avoiding. Whether I was willing to let them bury the truth, or whether I was prepared to stand by the record, even if it made me inconvenient again. The decision that exposed everything didn't come from leadership. It came from finance. On paper, it was minor, barely worth a meeting. A routine budget adjustment tied to a new initiative leadership wanted to announce before the quarter closed. Nothing flashy, nothing controversial. Just money moving. That's always how it starts. The request landed in my queue late on a Thursday afternoon. Tight deadline. Executive visibility. High priority flagged in red. I read it once. Then again. The numbers didn't align with the authority map leadership had just finalized. The governance committee had approved a framework, but the actual delegation hadn't been executed yet. Controls existed in theory, not in the system, which meant approving this would break the rules they'd just claimed were always in place. Finance knew it. They still sent it. I didn't reject it. I asked a question. Can you confirm which authority this is being approved under, per the updated structure? The reply came quickly. Too quickly. Per leadership direction. No name. No documentation. No approval chain. Just direction. That word again. I didn't respond right away, because this was the test. If I approved it, the rewritten story would hold. They'd point to this and say, see, the system works. She's aligned. Everything's fine. If I didn't, the cracks would show. I forwarded the request to legal. Not dramatically, just included them for clarity. Legal replied an hour later. They asked finance to confirm authority. Finance escalated to leadership. Leadership escalated to HR. HR escalated to me. They called it urgency. They said the delay would send the wrong signal. I said approving, without authority, would send a worse one. The tone shifted. Emails got sharper. Phrases like business impact and reputational risk started appearing. Someone suggested a temporary exception. I asked who would sign for it. Silence. That night, I went home knowing exactly what would happen next. Leadership would push. Finance would cave. And someone would try to override the system. The next morning, I logged in and saw the attempt. Another permissions change request. This time more aggressive. Someone had learned a little, but not enough. The system flagged it again. I documented it. Legal was already watching. By noon, the CFO called a meeting. Emergency. Everyone was invited. The room was tense before anyone spoke. The CFO opened by asking why a routine adjustment had become an escalation. Finance explained the urgency. Leadership explained the optics. HR explained the pressure. Then legal explained the risk. Finally, the CFO looked at me. Why didn't this move? He asked. I answered simply, because approving it would violate the authority structure leadership just approved. He frowned. That structure was designed to prevent dependency. Yes, I said, but it hasn't been implemented. Silence. Finance shifted uncomfortably. Someone said, we've always done it this way. I replied, that's not what the documentation says. Legal nodded. That was it. That was the moment the rewritten story collapsed. Because if the system had always worked, this wouldn't have stalled. If the governance changes had been proactive, this wouldn't be unclear. If the PIP had been about performance, none of this would matter. But it did. The CFO ended the meeting abruptly. Later that day, leadership sent out a message delaying the initiative. They blamed operational alignment. They didn't name why, but people noticed. Whispers started again. Not about me. About leadership. About control. About how fragile everything still was. Daniel didn't speak for the rest of the day. HR sent a carefully worded email thanking everyone for upholding governance. Legal archived the thread. Finance stopped pushing. And I sat at my desk, realizing something had shifted permanently. They couldn't pretend anymore. Not after a single, small decision exposed how much of the stability narrative was built on hope instead of structure. The PIP never came up again, not even indirectly. But neither did apologies, because accountability doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it just changes who gets questioned and who doesn't. By the end of the week, leadership requested a formal review of management decisions from earlier in the year. Plural. Daniel was asked to submit documentation. HR was asked to explain oversight. Finance was asked to recommend safeguards. I was asked to provide records. Again, I did. Because now, the truth wasn't inconvenient. It was necessary, and the quiet part everyone finally understood was this. They hadn't almost lost control because of one person. They'd almost lost it because they tried to silence the one person who understood it. The consequences didn't come with announcements. No emails. No meetings labeled accountability. No dramatic exits. They came quietly, the way real consequences usually do. First, Daniel was removed from decisions he used to own. It wasn't framed as discipline. It was framed as bandwidth management. Certain approvals now required secondary review. Certain initiatives were reassigned. His name stopped appearing as final authority. People noticed. Daniel noticed most of all. He grew careful, then withdrawn, then defensive. HR stopped using his language in documentation. The phrases he'd relied on, tone, resistance, fit, vanished from official records, replaced with words like governance, risk, and oversight. Those words mattered, because those words don't disappear when people do. Finance was given more visibility. Legal was looped in earlier. Leadership slowed down, not because they wanted to, because they had to. The review leadership had requested expanded quickly. What was supposed to be a narrow look at earlier decisions widened into a broader assessment of management practices. Patterns emerged, not just about me, about how often concerns were handled through performance processes instead of structural fixes, about how quickly inconvenient voices were labeled difficult, about how authority was delegated informally, then denied when it became uncomfortable. I wasn't the first. I'd just been the one holding something too important to ignore. Daniel submitted his documentation. It was thin. Emails, notes, vague impressions, nothing tying my behavior to operational risk. HR submitted theirs. They leaned heavily on manager discretion. Legal wasn't impressed. They asked why no escalation occurred when authority and responsibility were misaligned. HR didn't have an answer. By then, the auditors had returned with follow-ups. They wanted confirmation that the governance changes were complete. Leadership had to admit they weren't. That admission mattered, because now the timeline was clear. The instability hadn't been resolved by leadership foresight. It had been exposed by resistance. By me. People started saying my name differently. Not with admiration. With caution. Like they understood I wasn't someone to casually override. Daniel stopped speaking in meetings unless asked. When he did, he chose his words carefully. The confidence he'd once had was gone. HR stopped calling things people issues. They stopped suggesting mediation. They stopped trying to smooth over what had happened. They focused on compliance. That shift told me everything. One afternoon, the CFO asked to speak with me privately. No HR, no Daniel, just him. He didn't apologize, but he didn't defend the PIP either. He said, "We underestimated how much was concentrated in your role." I said, "I told my manager." He nodded slowly. That wasn't escalated. We sat with that. Then he said, "We're formalizing authority and succession planning." I asked with clarity. "Yes," he said. That was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I was going to get. After that conversation, things stabilized. Not comfortably, but deliberately. Processes were documented. Authority was mapped. Controls were implemented properly. Not quickly, not elegantly, but correctly. Daniel was reassigned to a narrower scope. He kept his title. He lost influence. HR restructured performance escalation guidelines. They added requirements, documentation thresholds, mandatory cross-functional review for senior staff. They didn't say my name. They didn't have to. The office settled into a new rhythm. People still worked. Deadlines still existed. But something had changed underneath it all. People hesitated before labeling someone difficult. They thought twice before using performance plans as leverage, because they'd seen what happened when the wrong person was pushed. And me? I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. The threat was gone, but so was the illusion. I understood now that organizations don't protect people. They protect narratives. And when narratives crack, they don't rush to fix them. They slow down and hope no one notices the damage. This time, too many people had noticed. And that meant the final question wasn't about punishment. It was about memory. Whether this would be remembered as a learning moment or quietly filed away as an anomaly. Because that determines whether it happens again. To someone else. Sooner. Nothing dramatic happened at the end. No final meeting. No speech. No moment where someone admitted they were wrong. The story didn't close with justice the way movies like to show it. It closed with normalization. Weeks passed. Then months. Systems worked the way they were supposed to. Approvals flowed through documented channels. Finance stopped panicking. Legal stopped hovering. Leadership stopped improvising. And the performance improvement plan? It was never mentioned again. Not in my file. Not in conversation. Not even as a cautionary tale. It simply vanished. That was the part that stayed with me. Because if I hadn't held something they needed, if the budget hadn't stalled, if finance hadn't panicked, if auditors hadn't noticed, nothing would have changed. I would have been labeled challenging. I would have been managed out, and the system would have continued pretending it worked. Daniel stayed. HR stayed. Leadership stayed. So did I. But the balance shifted permanently. Daniel no longer spoke over me. HR no longer used vague language around my role. Leadership no longer made assumptions without asking questions. Not because they trusted me more, but because they understood the cost of not understanding the system. People often think power is loud. It isn't. Real power is quiet. It's knowing where things stop moving. It's understanding which questions force honesty. It's documentation no one reads until they need it. I learned something important through all of this. Performance plans aren't always about performance. Sometimes they're about control. Sometimes they're about silencing friction instead of fixing structure. And sometimes they're used by people who don't fully understand what they're pushing against. What saved me wasn't emotion. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't even tenure. It was clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't sabotage. I asked questions. I documented answers. I followed the rules they claimed mattered. And that exposed the truth they didn't want examined. If I could say one thing to anyone watching this, it would be this. If your job depends on systems, learn them deeply. If your authority is informal, document it. If someone tries to reduce you to behavior, ask what structure they're avoiding. Because when things go wrong, narratives move faster than facts, and the only thing that survives that is a record. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been put on a performance plan that had nothing to do with your actual work? Have you ever watched leadership blame a person instead of fixing a broken system? Or were you the one holding everything together without anyone realizing it? Let me know in the comments. I read them all. And if stories like this feel familiar, if you've lived through workplace power plays, quiet retaliation, or systems that punish the wrong people, please subscribe to the channel, like this video so it reaches others who need to hear it. And comment your experience below, because these stories don't stay hidden forever. Sometimes they just wait for the right moment to be told.